Now imagine this. A young, ambitious reporter thinks they've got the perfect question to rattle one of Hollywood's most legendary figures, Clint Eastwood. But what happens next isn't what anyone expects. Clint Eastwood, a man who's seen it all, doesn't react with anger or frustration. Instead, he delivers a response so calm, so powerful, that it leaves the entire room in complete silence. What does Clint Eastwood teach this reporter? How does a quiet comeback become the most unforgettable moment of their career? Stick around to find out. It's a lesson in strength, wisdom, and the power of silence. You won't want to miss this. Before we dive into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more epic stories. The room was alive with energy, chaotic flashes from cameras, the low hum of whispered conversations, and the hurried shuffle of reporters adjusting their microphones and notepads. This wasn't just another press event. This was Clint Eastwood, the icon, the legend, sitting down for an interview, and everyone in the room knew it. His name was synonymous with grit, with power, with those unforgettable roles that had defined generations. And today, Clint was here, not for the usual accolades or the warm applause. Today was different. Clint Eastwood wasn't looking for validation. He didn't need to be told he was a star. He knew it, and more importantly, the world knew it. His years in the industry had earned him a place among the greats, and his influence on cinema and culture was undeniable. Yet here he was, not basking in his legacy, but standing at a crossroads where reflection, wisdom, and the passage of time seemed to weigh heavier on his mind than any award ever could. Seated at the head of the long, polished table, Clint appeared calm, collected, and unbothered by the frenzy surrounding him. His face, weathered by decades of hard work, life lived fully, and stories told, held an air of quiet authority. His eyes, sharp and still as ever, scanned the room briefly, taking in the sea of faces before him. He wasn't fazed by the attention, nor was he looking for sympathy. Clint Eastwood had long since stopped caring about the opinions of others. He knew who he was. Among the crowd of reporters stood one individual who wasn't like the rest. The young reporter, newly on the scene and already making waves in the industry, had a reputation for being bold, perhaps even reckless. They had gained recognition for their sharp tongue and the way they had challenged some of the biggest names in Hollywood. It was clear, this reporter was hungry. Hungry for a breakthrough moment. Hungry to make their name. And today, Clint Eastwood, the man who had weathered the test of time, was going to be their prey. The young reporter had watched Clint for years, admired his films, his tough demeanor, and his unwavering presence. But they also saw something else, a vulnerability, perhaps, hidden beneath that stoic mask. It wasn't just Clint's age that they sought to exploit. It was the idea that time had passed him by, that the world had moved on and left Clint Eastwood behind. They'd heard whispers from other young reporters, dismissing Clint's generation as yesterday's news, clinging to old ways while the industry surged forward with new stars, new trends. It was the perfect opportunity. They had seen the way others fawned over Clint, the interviews where the actor was treated like royalty, praised for his past accomplishments, showered with reverence. But the young reporter wasn't interested in that. No, they wanted to stir the pot, to rattle the cage and see if they could get a rise from a man who had, for so long, been unshakable. They had a plan, one that would send shockwaves through the media, something that would make headlines. A single question, cutting, sharp, and calculated. Something that would make Clint Eastwood pause. The reporter studied Clint's entrance, his calm, confident stride as he made his way to the chair at the front of the room. It was impossible to ignore him. Clint Eastwood didn't need to speak to command attention. He simply was. His presence was magnetic. Even after all these years, after the countless interviews and moments in the spotlight, Clint still had that rare ability to fill any room, to make all eyes turn toward him. But the reporter wasn't looking at Clint the way the others were. While the room was focused on the man, the legacy, the icon, the reporter's eyes were locked onto the opportunity. This wasn't just an interview, it was a battleground. And they, the young reporter, were ready to take on the legend. They knew this was their chance to make a statement, to bring Clint Eastwood down from his pedestal and prove, in front of a room full of people, that they could outwit him, that they could make him blink. Clint didn't look around the room, didn't glance toward the reporter. He didn't need to. He was here for a purpose, not for distractions or games. And as the young reporter sat there, preparing for their moment to strike. The tension in the room grew. The atmosphere was electric. It wasn't just the usual buzz of a press conference. It was the kind of anticipation that comes when something is about to happen, something big, something unexpected. The reporter's pulse quickened. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. As Clint settled into his chair, the eyes of the room turned to the young reporter, knowing full well they were about to ask something bold, something that would shift the course of the interview. And as the spotlight shifted ever so slightly toward them, the reporter smiled, because they were about to ask a question that would make history. The room was thick with anticipation. The air hung heavy, as though everyone could sense that something was about to break. Clint Eastwood sat with the quiet confidence of a man who had weathered storms, both in Hollywood and in life. His gaze was steady, unblinking, almost impervious to the world around him. He had been here before, done this 1,000 times. But not this time. Not with the young reporter, who had been watching him from the moment he stepped into the room. The reporter, with their sharp suit and youthful energy, was ready. They had been waiting for this opportunity for weeks, waiting to confront the man who had defined an entire generation of cinema. They thought it was the perfect setup. As Clint adjusted in his chair, the reporter stood up and cleared their throat. The room fell silent, sensing the question was coming, the one that would set the tone for the entire interview. "Mr. Eastwood," the reporter began, their voice smooth but laced with an unmistakable edge. "You've had a long and storied career, but let's be honest. Do you ever feel like you've become a relic of a bygone era? I mean, the world's changed. The film industry has changed. Do you think you still have what it takes to teach the younger generation anything? Or are you stuck in the past?" The reporter's words hung in the air like a dare. It was a question intended to sting, to pierce the tough exterior Clint had built over decades. They watched closely, almost eagerly, waiting for the inevitable response. They expected it to come, perhaps a flash of anger, maybe even an outburst. Something that would prove to the world that Clint was no longer the indomitable force he had once been. The reporter's heart beat faster, adrenaline coursing through their veins. This was it. This was their moment. They had asked the question no one else had the guts to ask. They had just taken down a giant. At least, that's how they saw it. But the room didn't react as expected. There was no angry retort, no flare of emotion from Clint, no dramatic sigh or rolling of the eyes. Instead, the room was filled with an uncomfortable silence. The other reporters, who had been waiting for Clint to snap back, exchanged uncertain glances. They weren't sure if they had just witnessed the beginning of a showdown, or if they were witnessing a slow-motion car crash. Clint sat still, his expression unreadable, his face a mask of calm. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. It was as though he hadn't heard the question, or perhaps he just didn't think it deserved a reaction. But the reporter wasn't backing down. They stared at Clint, waiting for the answer that would surely come. They were expecting a reaction, anything that would prove them right. Maybe Clint would get defensive. Maybe he'd make a snide comment, or perhaps dismiss the question with a joke. The reporter was ready for all of it, but they weren't prepared for what happened next. Clint didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity. The silence stretched, a thick, suffocating presence in the room. It wasn't uncomfortable for Clint. It was simply a part of who he was. But for the reporter, the silence was suffocating. Their words hung in the air, unanswered. Finally, Clint spoke. His voice was low, steady, and deliberate. There was no anger in it, no bitterness. It wasn't a shout, but it carried the weight of 1,000 experiences. A lifetime of facing down adversaries, both on and off screen. Clint's response was quiet, almost intimate, and yet it carried more weight than anything the reporter could have imagined. "The problem with the new generation," Clint said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "is that they think everything needs to be loud to matter. Some things don't need to be shouted to be heard." The reporter froze. The room froze. Clint's words settled in the air like a final verdict, impossible to ignore. There was no anger in his voice, no mocking tone. Just the calm assurance of someone who had nothing to prove. The reporter's mouth went dry. They had expected a battle, a fight, something that would give them the upper hand. Instead, Clint had turned their question on its head, disarming them with a quiet truth. The words hung there, resonating in the room, leaving no space for rebuttal. The reporter's smugness faltered. The boldness they had carried into the room evaporated in an instant. They tried to find something to say, some quick-witted retort, but the words caught in their throat. There was nothing, just the weight of Clint's response, and the realization that they had just been bested by a man who had mastered the art of silence. The room was still. For a moment, it felt like the world had pressed pause. The only sound was the faint click of a camera shutter, an awkward reminder of the situation unfolding in front of everyone. The reporter, still reeling from the weight of Clint's words, was no longer the one in control. They had expected Clint to crack. They had hoped for some explosive reaction, something they could spin into a viral moment. But instead, Clint Eastwood, the very man they had tried to provoke, simply sat there unfazed. He was like a rock in the middle of a storm, unmovable, unshaken, and utterly composed. Clint didn't rush to fill the silence. His gaze remained steady, his eyes never leaving the reporter. It wasn't a glare, it was simply the unwavering focus of a man who had seen it all. No arrogance, no bravado, just a quiet, almost peaceful authority that radiated from him. And then he spoke. "Some things don't need to be shouted to be heard," Clint repeated, his voice still low, still measured, but this time with an added layer of meaning. It wasn't an insult, it was a lesson. A quiet rebuke wrapped in a calm delivery. The reporter, who had once been filled with confidence, now sat paralyzed. The smirk that had once adorned their face was gone, replaced by something that resembled uncertainty, perhaps even regret. They had asked a question, sure, but what they had failed to anticipate was the depth of Clint's character, the wisdom and strength that came not from his words, but from his silence. The reporter's bravado had been met with Clint's steadfastness, and in the process, they had been disarmed, not with anger, but with sheer presence. The other reporters in the room seemed to hold their breath. Some exchanged subtle glances, clearly recognizing the power of Clint's response. There was a shift in the atmosphere, like the entire room had just collectively realized they were witnessing something far more profound than an interview. This wasn't just about Clint Eastwood. This was a lesson in humility, in strength, in the art of being unfazed. The reporter, trying to salvage some shred of control, opened their mouth, but no words came. They had expected a loud clash, a confrontation they could build a story around. Instead, Clint's composed response had left them with nothing. Their earlier confidence, the smugness that had fueled their question, had evaporated, replaced by an uneasy silence they didn't know how to fill. The minutes stretched on, each second longer than the last. The reporter, who had prided themselves on their sharp tongue, was now tongue-tied. The press conference had taken a turn, and it was clear to everyone in the room that Clint Eastwood had once again proven why he was a living legend. The silence in the room stretched on, thicker than before. It was as if time had slowed, and in that frozen moment, the young reporter felt every pair of eyes on them, eyes that had once been eager, anticipating the next sharp, provocative remark. Now those eyes were filled with something else, an unspoken judgment, a quiet acknowledgement that the reporter had missed the mark. Clint Eastwood, unmoved by the tension, simply sat there, his posture relaxed, his eyes still unwavering. It wasn't that he was unaware of the atmosphere in the room. It was just that he didn't feel the need to engage in the kind of back and forth the reporter was hoping for. His silence was a force in itself, a message that needed no elaboration. The reporter's mind raced. They couldn't let it end like this. They had come here to make a name for themselves, to be the one who challenged Clint, to ask the question no one else dared. But now they had nothing. Nothing but the cold sweat gathering on their brow, the tightness in their chest, and the growing realization that they had completely miscalculated. They opened their mouth, but the words came out in a rush, stilted, desperate. "Mr. Eastwood, I didn't mean to offend you," the reporter stammered, trying to regain control of the conversation. "It's just that, the world is changing, and the industry is." But Clint cut them off, his voice calm and even. "You didn't offend me. You just asked a question that doesn't matter," he said, his words carrying weight, but still devoid of malice. The reporter's face flushed. They could feel the eyes of the room, the heavy stares of the other reporters, who were now watching with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. They had expected to witness Clint Eastwood's vulnerability, his frustration, perhaps even his anger. But what they had gotten instead was an unyielding wall of calm. And worse, They realized that they were the ones who looked vulnerable now. Desperation crept into the reporter's voice. Well, it's just that you've been around for so long, and maybe it's time to pass the torch. Don't you think? Clint's lips twitched, the barest hint of a smile, though it was far from warm. You think it's time to pass the torch? He asked, his voice still soft but carrying an undeniable edge. Kid, the torch doesn't need passing. It burns just fine without anyone handing it off. The words stung, sharp and direct, but it was the calmness with which Clint said them that left the reporter reeling. There was no confrontation, no flare of temper, just the quiet assurance of someone who had nothing to prove. The reporters shifted uncomfortably in their seat, their earlier confidence slipping away with each failed attempt to regain control. They fumbled for another question, some way to turn the interview around, but the moment was lost. The power had shifted. Clint had subtly taken command, and the reporter was left floundering, looking for a lifeline that wasn't there. Clint, with his unshakable presence, wasn't just shutting down the reporter's questions. He was teaching them a lesson in humility, in how strength doesn't always need to be flaunted. It was in the quiet confidence of someone who knew that time had already passed judgment, and no amount of provocations could shift that reality. As the room watched, the reporters sank lower into their seat. They had started the interview with the intention of making a name for themselves, of throwing Clint Eastwood off balance, but instead, they had become the story. They had tried to provoke, but all they had earned was silence, a silence that spoke louder than any words could. And in that silence, Clint Eastwood's legacy grew even stronger. No grand speech, no loud declaration, just a man who knew exactly who he was, and wasn't afraid to let the world see it. The reporter had failed to shake him, and now, they were the one who had been shaken. The moment hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating any chance the reporter had of recovering. The desperate attempts to regain control only seemed to make things worse. Every word they stuttered, every shaky question they asked, felt like another misstep, another sign that they had lost their footing entirely. Clint Eastwood didn't rush. He didn't need to. His eyes, steady and unblinking, continued to hold the room, his calm presence like a calm before the storm. Except there was no storm. There never was. Clint was the storm. And the reporter? They were already caught in its quiet force. The reporter finally fell silent. They had no more words. No more clever jabs or deflecting questions. They were staring at Clint now, almost searching for a response that would allow them to salvage something from this moment of humiliation. But Clint didn't give them that. He leaned back in his chair, a small shift that seemed to signify the end of the exchange. His expression remained neutral, but there was something undeniably powerful about the way he carried himself. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't mocking the reporter. He was simply being Clint Eastwood, and that, in itself, was enough. Then, finally, Clint spoke, his voice as steady as it had been from the very start. "If you want to be remembered, kid," he said, his tone still calm but piercing, "make sure it's for something worth remembering." The room, which had been tense with uncertainty just moments before, now felt as though the weight of Clint's words was settling in. His final sentence wasn't a jab at the reporter. It was a quiet lesson, a statement about legacy, about character, about what truly matters. In those few words, Clint had not only disarmed the reporter, but had reinforced the point he'd made earlier. Legacy isn't built on cheap stunts or viral moments. It's built on actions. It's built on silence, on strength, and on the kind of wisdom that time bestows. The reporter didn't respond. They couldn't. The room was quiet, too quiet. There was nothing left to say. The opportunity to shake Clint Eastwood had come and gone, and now, the reporter was simply left in the aftershock of their own failed ambition. They hadn't earned their place at the table today. Instead, they had been humbled by a man who had no need to prove anything to anyone. Clint didn't look around for approval. He didn't wait for applause or even recognition. He simply looked at the reporter, his eyes sharp, but not with anger, just the quiet understanding of a man who had seen far more than the reporter could ever understand. His presence was enough. It always had been. As the interview continued, it became increasingly clear that Clint Eastwood had won, not with a loud retort or fiery anger, but with his unshakable demeanor, with the steady strength that had defined him for decades. The reporter, having lost the battle, had no choice but to retreat into their seat, their earlier confidence replaced with a quiet, almost embarrassed defeat. The rest of the room began to shift back to the rhythm of the press conference, but something had changed. The dynamic was different now. Clint Eastwood's quiet victory had left a mark that would linger long after the cameras stopped rolling. The reporter would leave the room with a story, but it wasn't the one they had hoped for. Clint Eastwood, with his legendary calm, had once again proven why he was not only a star but a master of the game. The reporter's failed attempt to rattle him had only cemented Clint's position as the man who needed no defense. He was the storm that came and went, leaving everything still in its wake. The room had returned to its usual rhythm, but the tension that once filled the air had dissipated, leaving behind an almost surreal calm. The cameras continued to flash, the microphones continued to record, and the questions continued to come, but for the reporter, everything had changed. They sat back in their seat, their hands trembling slightly, trying to focus on the words being spoken around them, but their mind kept returning to Clint, to his response, to the way he had dismantled their question with nothing more than a few carefully chosen words, delivered with the quiet force of someone who had lived through far more than any of them could imagine. The reporter's earlier bravado felt like a distant memory now. What had seemed like a surefire plan to make their mark, to challenge one of Hollywood's biggest legends, now felt foolish. They had come into that room expecting Clint Eastwood to give them a moment of weakness, of defensiveness, something they could use to make their name. But instead, they had gotten something entirely different. Something they hadn't expected, Clint Eastwood's quiet, unflappable strength. As the interview continued, the reporter couldn't help but replay the interaction in their head. What went wrong? They wondered. I thought I had him. But no matter how they tried to rationalize it, the truth was undeniable. Clint Eastwood hadn't been rattled, and in doing so, he had shown the reporter something more valuable than any headline could offer. Clint's words echoed in their mind. Some things don't need to be shouted to be heard. They had expected noise, a spectacle, a confrontation. But what Clint had given them was silence, a silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. And it wasn't just a clever retort. It was a lesson in how to handle life's most trying moments, with composure, with dignity, and with the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself to anyone. The reporter felt a pang of realization. They had asked the wrong question. It wasn't about Clint Eastwood's age or his place in the modern world. It was about something far deeper. It was about understanding that true power doesn't come from trying to tear others down or make them feel small. True power comes from within, from knowing who you are and letting the world see it, without needing to make a spectacle of it. They had tried to provoke Clint. They had tried to show the world that they were daring enough to challenge a legend. But instead, they had learned a humbling lesson in respect, in the value of silence, and in the quiet strength that comes from experience. The reporter leaned back in their seat, taking a deep breath. For the first time, they felt the weight of what had just transpired. They had been humbled, and though it was uncomfortable, it was also a gift. The lesson Clint had unknowingly taught them wasn't something they could have learned in a classroom or from any of the books they had read. It was something they had to experience. As the press conference came to a close, the reporter caught Clint's eye. It was a brief moment, just a flicker of recognition, but it was enough. Clint didn't look at them with scorn or judgment. He didn't need to. His gaze was steady, unwavering, as if to say, "You'll figure it out." The young reporter left the room that day with a new understanding of what it meant to make a name for yourself. They hadn't earned it through sharp words or viral moments. They hadn't earned it through mocking the giants of the past. No, the reporter would earn their place through something more lasting, something Clint Eastwood had shown them that day. They would earn it through strength, integrity, and the wisdom to know when to remain silent.